Ren Caro drove into the Holt place on a road that wasn't a road so much as a memory of one. 2 chalky ruts braided through broomweed and needlegrass, and the color of the dust changing with the light, mauve toward evening and copper at noon. And it was a noon that tasted like copper and old pennies when she cut the engine and let the silence take the heat. The truck ticking and the cicadas drilling 1,000 tiny holes through the air. Asher Holt watched her from the shade of the windmill tower. Hat slanted low, eyes narrowed into the kind of squint that came of years spent measuring storms and strangers. And he didn't move until she opened the door and stumbled, hand catching the frame as if the land had tilted under her. A woman strong enough to carry a case of sample bottles and a bad reputation, yet suddenly small against the endless scrape of sky. The first thing she did was look past him toward the pump house as if it had called her by name. And the second thing she did was look at her hands like they were someone else's hands. Dust in the creases, knuckles gone pale. And then her voice broke the way something breaks when it's been bent too long, and she said, "I'm not clean anymore," she cried. And the words carried farther than they should have, over the hot steel of the trough and the cracked china lip of the cistern, and into the cottonwoods that lined the dry creek like a congregation with nothing left to pray. Asher's jaw shifted the way a horse shifts weight before it bolts, and he didn't touch her, didn't come close, only tipped his chin toward the pump house and said, "You came for the water." A statement and a question, and Ren swallowed, once twice the way a person swallows a name they don't want to hear, and nodded. Inside the pump house the air was a stew of creosote and iron, and the faint dog breath of mouse droppings. The hum of the plugged-in world pared down to the lazy churn of the windmill wheel outside, and the steady cough of the pump that had been coaxed through one more season with baling wire and prayer. And Ren's gaze jumped to the intake screen, the burlap filter cloth she'd told him to rig in their last phone call like a triage bandage on a bullet hole. And Asher said, "We've had 3 calves go off feed in a week, and my foreman's boy got hives up to his chin when he washed his face at the yard spigot." And Ren's hands were already moving, case open, zipper whispering like gossip in a back pew. She was good at this, had been good at this before the bounty hunters with white teeth and polished boots slid a manila envelope across a cafe table and said words like expedite and corridor and community partnership, and before she learned what it was to lose sleep to a number on a check and the sound of her own pen scratching a signature onto a report that her grandmother, who taught her that water remembers, would never have forgiven. "No offense, Ms. Caro," Asher said, "but I asked for you because you used to make trouble." And Ren flinched like the name had teeth, like the word used to had bit down, and she said, "Make trouble is what we called telling the truth, before Caden Minerals opened an office on Main and started buying free lunches." And her smile was the dry, cracked kind, a smile that let you see the empty tanks behind it. She moved to the intake and Asher moved with her, and he reached for the tie on the filter cloth. Fingers steady in that way. Men's fingers are steady when the thing they're doing feels like pulling out a splinter from bone. And in the moment, before he touched it, Ren wanted to tell him to stop, to let the not knowing keep them whole for 10 more seconds, to leave the world in the state where maybe it wasn't poison, and maybe it wasn't a sellout, and maybe she hadn't traded her name for a voucher and a wink. But Asher had never been a man for maybe, and he pulled the cloth, and as it came away the light caught a slick the color of bad rainbows, swirls of oil sheen green and bruised purple dancing across the water's skin, and his face went a shade nobody out here had a name for, something lost between dust and ash. He didn't cuss, didn't spit, didn't throw the thing to the floor. He only held it up and looked at it the way a father looks at a report card that's a prophecy, and the smell rolled off it like a memory Ren had tried to drown. Sweet and biting, solvent with a citrus backhand that tickled the sinuses and lived in the head for hours. "Halogenated," she said before she could stop herself, the old training crawling up her throat. Or a cousin. And then she saw it, the thing that made the air hitch in Asher's chest. The cloth wasn't the one she'd sent in the kit at all. Not the plain weave burlap with the purple thread she'd stitched to market. This one had an embroidered edge, a neat chain of little wheat stalks, the exact stitch that lived on the blankets in the Holt house, on the table runners in the kitchen where a woman with copper hair and a laugh like river wind had once stood, muttering recipes and humming hymns, a woman whose absence was a kind of weather. Asher held it like he was holding a ghost hand and said, "Too soft, too careful. This came out of my mother's hope chest. and Wren felt her stomach turn like clay in a potter's fist. Not because the water was bad. She'd known. The water was bad. Bad as a grudge. But because the bad had come wrapped in home, and bad wrapped in home is the kind that sticks to a place for generations. Outside, a pickup rolled by on the county road and didn't slow. And somewhere far off, a train laid its sorrow down the tracks. And Wren felt the heat rise from the floor like something alive. She thought of the envelope in her bag, the neat stack of bills that weren't hers anymore because she'd returned them with shaking hands and gotten back a memo with 6 words. You can't clean what's soaked, and she wanted to scrub her tongue, to wash her eyes. They've been skimming the holding ponds up north, Wren said, words coming like a confession to a man who'd never asked to be a priest. Not the company, the subcontractors, the small ones with the big mouths. There's a citrus, degreaser they use to break the films. They're not supposed to let it anywhere near groundwater, but it's cheap and it looks like work when you spray it. If they dump near a sink or if it ran the wrong way, with this drought the aquifer can't forgive fast. And Asher finally set the cloth down, gently as a folded flag, and said, Forgiveness ain't the issue. And for the first time since she'd met him, his voice trembled. Wren popped 2 test vials, filled them, capped them, shook. Labels like tiny tombstones lining up on the bench, while her mind ran back to the meeting that ruined her, to a windowless room where Caden's liaison had said, We need a steward who understands the realities of rural economics, and had handed her a community grant application with her name already typed at the bottom, and she had taken it, and for 3 months she'd lived like a paper-thin version of herself. Windows closed, music off, phone off, waking to her grandmother's voice in the dark. We are what we carry. I carried the wrong thing, she whispered, not meaning to say it out loud, and Asher said, You carried it here, which might have been kindness or accusation, and maybe it was both. From the doorway, the light cut a clean rectangle across, the concrete full of falling dust like slow snow. And in that light something flashed. A corner of an envelope tucked behind the breaker box. A wedge of manila just far enough out to be a dare. Asher didn't even see it, eyes pinned to the water like he could will it back into virtue. And Wren crossed, slid her fingers along the grate, tugged, felt the paper rasp her skin, and when it came free she knew the weight before she looked. The thickness of a thing you don't earn. Inside were photocopies of a contract, Holt Ranch letterhead, an agreement dated 12 years back, signature lines inked by Asher's late father, and a Caden executive whose name was a rumor with a golf handicap. Boilerplate about access roads, and temporary staging and limited easements, and tucked behind the last page, a check stub from a fund that called itself Heritage Stewardship. They built a road across your southern pasture, Wren said, and they paid to call it help. And Asher laughed once, a sound like a boot heel cracking a scorpion, and said, Daddy loved 2 things more than the land. Sunday dinners, and a sure bet. And Wren watched his eyes as he did the math that turns a legacy into a ledger. The wind stumbled outside, a clatter of tin against tin, and then there was another sound, a thin mosquito whine that wasn't wind and wasn't grass, and Wren went very still because she knew that sound as well as her own name now. Drone rotors, small and slick and cheap, the kind you could buy at the feed store to check fences and the kind cheap men used to check people. Asher heard it a beat later, head cocked, hand going to the tool shelf the way other men go to a holster, and he pulled down a length of rebar as if it had a better memory than he did. Wren slid the envelope under the pump, where the dark and dust could swallow it for a minute, and when the drone's shadow ghosted across the pump house door like a hand passing over a face, Asher moved first, stepped into the light and looked up into the white glare of a little eye and didn't flinch. The drone hovered, dipped, and Wren swore she saw it tilt as if it were curious, as if it wanted to see whether the man in the hat and the woman with the case would keep their mouths shut. Asher raised the rebar and the thing jerked up like a bird that had heard the hawk, and it slid away, almost lazy, toward the north where the pipeline cut the horizon like a scar. And he stood there until the whine went away and the silence came back like a tide. You bring anyone else with you?